I had dreamed of this night my whole life. The wedding, the love, the start of forever with the man I trusted most. But the moment I saw his phone light up with messages from another woman, everything I believed in crumbled. The man I married was not who I thought he was, and the perfect wedding light I had imagined turned into a nightmare I could never forget. My heart felt like it had been wrenched from my chest, replaced by a cold, heavy panic that refused to let go. Every happy memory of the day suddenly felt tainted, every smile a lie that I had believed in blindly. The wedding itself had been flawless, or so I thought. The flowers smelled heavenly, the soft music filled the air, and everyone around us was laughing, celebrating, cheering for our union. I had imagined this moment countless times, walking down the aisle, seeing him waiting for me, the joy of finally becoming his wife. But as I stepped into the room that would be ours that night, the first subtle signs of unease began to creep in. He smiled, but it was distant, forced, almost hollow. He kept checking his phone, laughing at messages I couldn't read, and every glance away from me made my stomach tighten with a sense of foreboding. We entered our honeymoon suite, and I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. I had dreamed of this night, the intimacy, the laughter, the closeness, and I was determined to make it perfect despite the unease. I reached for him, expecting warmth, excitement, the soft comfort of a man who loved me. But he recoiled slightly, his movements stiff and calculated. The distance between us felt enormous, invisible yet suffocating, and a shiver ran down my spine. That was the first moment I realized something wasn't right, something I couldn't yet fully understand. I tried to speak to him lightly, to laugh, to brush off the tension, but his words were clipped, his tone distant. Every attempt at closeness was met with subtle avoidance, every gesture carefully measured. I felt the first sparks of doubt flare inside me, doubt I tried to suppress with reason and hope. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the day had overwhelmed him, I told myself. But even as I said it, I knew that the instinct gnawing at me, that cold knot of fear, was never wrong. I could feel it deep inside. The perfect night I had imagined was unraveling before my eyes. Hours passed, and the tension between us grew unbearable. My heart raced, my mind replaying every small detail, every unusual glance, every unexplained hesitation from earlier that day. I had trusted him with everything, but now every memory, every whispered promise, every laugh seemed like a lie he had perfected over time. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand the truth, but I stayed silent, letting my instincts guide me toward the inevitable revelation that awaited. My mind spun with questions that demanded answers I feared to hear. And then I saw it. The screen of his phone glowing in the dim light, a message from a name I didn't know, words of affection and intimacy that were never meant for me. My chest tightened, and a wave of icy fear and fury crashed over me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't fatigue, and it wasn't nerves. This was betrayal, plain and simple. The man I had given my heart to, the man I had promised myself to for life, had already begun tearing apart our marriage on the very first night. I confronted him immediately, my voice trembling with rage and heartbreak as I held his phone like a weapon of truth. He tried to explain, to deny, to justify, but his words were weak, meaningless, empty. Every excuse he offered felt like salt in an open wound. I realized in that instant that the love I had believed in had been nothing but a mask, a performance designed to hide the man's true self. And in the quiet of that room, under the soft glow of the wedding lights, I made a silent vow. I would not break. I would not cry. I would survive this, and someday he would pay for the life he had tried to steal from me. I couldn't breathe. The weight of what I had just discovered pressed down on me like 1,000 bricks. Every laugh, every shared secret, every promise we had made suddenly felt like a cruel joke. How could he do this to me? On our wedding night, no less, the night that was supposed to mark the beginning of our life together. My hands shook, my mind raced, and I felt a mixture of grief and fury that I had never known before. I wanted to run, to escape, to scream, yet a part of me refused to leave. I had to know everything. I needed to see just how deep this betrayal went. I picked up his phone again, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through the messages. There were dozens. Texts, photos, notes, even plans for secret meetings that had taken place while I was planning the perfect wedding. Each message cut through me like a knife, each one a reminder that the life I thought I was living had been a lie. I saw words of love meant for her, hidden affection, intimate secrets that were never shared with me. My stomach churned and I felt a cold rage bubbling inside. This wasn't just cheating, it was calculated, deliberate, and ongoing. When I finally turned to face him, his face was pale, eyes avoiding mine, hands shaking slightly. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but his words sounded hollow, meaningless. Every excuse, every denial only fueled my anger further. How could he lie to me with such ease, knowing that I had given him my whole heart? I realized then that trust, once broken, could never be the same again. And on this night, the first night of what was supposed to be our forever, he had destroyed it completely. I left the bed and walked to the window, needing distance to think, needing air to calm my racing heart. The city lights shimmered below, but they couldn't touch the darkness that had settled over me. I thought of the vows we had exchanged, of the promises whispered under the soft glow of candles and music. Every word now seemed tainted, a mockery of what should have been sacred. I realized that I couldn't ignore it, couldn't forgive it, at least not yet. I needed a plan. I needed to reclaim control over my life, to find a way to survive this betrayal and ensure that he understood the gravity of what he had done. The hours passed, but sleep was impossible. Every little sound in the room made me jump. His sighs, the rustle of sheets, the soft glow of the phone screen. I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. And yet, amidst the pain, a strange clarity emerged. I could feel a quiet power growing inside me, a sense of determination that I hadn't known I possessed. This was no longer just heartbreak. It was the beginning of my awakening, a turning point where I would decide whether to crumble or rise. By midnight, I had made a silent vow to myself. I would not let this define me.
I would not let his lies and deceit steal my strength. I would endure, I would survive, and someday I would make him pay, not with hatred, but with the quiet, unshakable power of someone who had been wronged and refused to stay broken. That night, I realized that betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the spark that would ignite my transformation, the first step toward reclaiming my life. As I finally closed his phone and turned away, I could feel the shift within me. Fear and heartbreak still lingered, but they were accompanied by a fierce determination. I would watch, I would wait, and I would gather every piece of evidence, every truth hidden in shadows, until the day he could no longer deny it. That night, the first night of our marriage, became the night I stopped being just a victim. It became the night I began my journey toward justice. The next morning, I woke with a sense of hollow emptiness, my mind replaying the events of the previous night like a broken record. Every memory of his touch, every whispered word, every laugh shared in those fleeting moments of happiness now felt tainted. I couldn't trust my own eyes anymore. The man I had married, the one I had given my heart to completely, was hiding a side of himself that I had never seen and maybe never would have if I hadn't looked closely enough. A sense of determination started to replace the initial shock. I couldn't allow myself to crumble. I had to understand the full extent of his deceit. I began paying attention to his habits, his mannerisms, the subtle inconsistencies in his stories. He smiled at me, but sometimes it didn't reach his eyes. He talked about mundane things, trying to maintain normalcy, but his phone never left his side. I noticed him slipping messages into the shadows of the room, conversations disappearing when he thought I wasn't looking. Each small lie, each hidden glance built a picture that I had never imagined I would have to see on my wedding night. It was almost cinematic in its cruelty, the perfect facade hiding a dark, unfaithful reality. By afternoon, I decided to check things more carefully. I didn't rush or act out of anger. I needed clarity, not chaos. I went through his personal belongings cautiously, finding receipts, notes, and subtle traces of the other woman's presence. A quiet fury burned inside me, sharp and consuming. I realized that his betrayal wasn't a mistake or a fleeting temptation. It was deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. The man who had promised me forever had been leading a double life while I prepared to give him my everything. I confronted him subtly that evening, asking questions in a calm, measured tone that betrayed none of the storm raging inside me. He stumbled, fumbled, tried to dodge, but the cracks in his behavior were unmistakable. I could see the panic start to rise in his eyes, a tiny spark of fear that gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time, I realized that power was no longer fully his. I had discovered his secrets, and that knowledge, though painful, had shifted the balance slightly. As night fell, I made a decision. I would not confront him fully yet, not tonight, not without preparation. I needed to observe, to gather every piece of evidence to ensure that when the moment came, he could not deflect, deny, or manipulate the truth. My heart ached with a mixture of betrayal and anticipation. I wanted to cry, but I refused. I wanted to scream, but I knew silence would be my weapon. The man who had tried to deceive me would eventually realize that he had underestimated me. By the time I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. I had been blindsided by love and betrayal, yet within that darkness, a fire had been ignited. I promised myself that I would take control of this story, that I would not allow heartbreak to define me, and that I would make him accountable for every lie he had ever told. That night, I understood that the first step toward reclaiming my life was patience, observation, and strategy.
Even in my most private moments, I planned silently. I replayed the events of the day, made mental notes, and visualized the confrontation that would one day come. The man who had destroyed my wedding night would eventually see that I was not powerless. I would not let the perfect facade of our marriage fool anyone, least of all him. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I knew that the nightmare of our first night was only the beginning of a story he would one day regret. The days following our wedding night were unbearable. Every interaction with him felt like walking on broken glass. I smiled when I needed to, laughed when he made a joke, all while my mind dissected every word, every gesture, every hidden glance. I began observing him like a hawk, noting patterns, small inconsistencies, the way he hid his phone, the subtle tension that appeared whenever I asked innocuous questions. Each moment confirmed my worst fears. His betrayal wasn't a one-time mistake. It was ongoing, methodical, and calculated. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying conversations from the day, reading between the lines of every word he had said. I remembered the way he had smiled at me during the ceremony, that charming, practiced smile I had once adored. Now it felt hollow, almost cruel. The reality was sinking in deeper. The man I had married was a stranger in disguise. My chest ached, but beneath the pain, a fire began to burn. I would not let him destroy me, not completely. I needed a plan and I needed patience. I started gathering evidence discreetly. His phone became my window into the truth, but I also observed his habits in person, how he avoided certain topics, who he called in secret, where he slipped away when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Each small discovery fed my determination. I realized I needed to approach this carefully. Impulsive confrontation would only give him the advantage. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his deception when the time came. Every hidden message, every secret meeting, every whispered lie would be accounted for. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this man had no regard for my feelings, for the promises we had exchanged, for the life we had just begun. It was as if he had been living a parallel life, one I had no part in. And yet, watching him, I noticed cracks forming in his confidence. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face, not because I had confronted him, but because I had begun to see the truth clearly. I realized that knowledge was my weapon, patience my ally.
During these quiet hours of observation, I also began reflecting on myself, my own strength, my own resilience. I have been blindsided by love, but I would not allow that same vulnerability to break me. I visualized a future where I was in control, where he could no longer manipulate or deceive without consequence. The thought of reclaiming my power, of seeing him face the truth of his betrayal, filled me with a dark satisfaction I hadn't expected. It wasn't hatred, it was justice, and I would take it carefully, deliberately. Every day became a calculated routine: observe, gather proof, anticipate his lies, and remained outwardly calm. I smiled when he entered the room, laughed at his jokes, all while cataloging every inconsistency, every hidden secret. He had no idea that the woman he had tried to deceive was already planning her moves, silently preparing for the day when all his carefully constructed lies would collapse. The irony was bitter but satisfying. He thought he was the puppet master, yet I was slowly weaving the strings that would one day control him. By the end of the week, I had pieced together a detailed picture of his duplicity. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, and yet, instead of breaking me, it had given me focus. I realized that the nightmare of our first night had been only the beginning, a catalyst that transformed fear and heartbreak into determination and strategy. The man who thought he could hide behind his charm and lies had underestimated me, and I intended to make him regret it profoundly. By the fifth day after our wedding, I knew I had to act carefully. Observation alone was no longer enough. I needed proof, undeniable evidence of his betrayal. I couldn't confront him blindly, not yet. The fear, the heartbreak, and the anger inside me had transformed into something sharper, a quiet, calculating resolve. I needed to see just how far his deception went, and I knew that subtle tests would reveal more than accusations ever could. I began with small traps, harmless on the surface, but designed to catch him off guard. I left my phone unlocked on the table with a message drafted but unsent, knowing he would notice. I mentioned places I had planned to visit, expecting him to respond in ways that might reveal hidden truths. Every gesture, every carefully worded sentence was a probe, a measure of his honesty, and I watched him like a hawk. His reactions were subtle, micro expressions, slight hesitation, quick excuses, but they told me everything I needed to know. He was guilty, and I had caught him without a single word of confrontation. The more I tested him, the more I realized how deeply he had embedded the other woman into our lives. Phone calls he said were work-related led nowhere. Messages he tried to hide suddenly became clearer in context, and his own nervous habits betrayed him repeatedly. I could almost see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade, each one widening as I pressed silently, watching him falter without realizing it. It was painful, yes, watching someone you loved betray you, but also empowering. For the first time, I felt in control, a silent authority over the truth he had tried to bury. That evening, I created an opportunity to observe him more closely. I pretended to be exhausted from the day, retiring to the room while he remained distracted with a task in another part of the house. I noticed him checking his phone more often, glancing at messages, even whispering under his breath. Every small action, every hidden glance was like a confirmation of everything I already suspected. My heart ached with betrayal, but I refused to let it dictate my behavior. Anger was dangerous, but strategy was lethal. I also began recording details mentally. Times, dates, conversations, behaviors, anything that could later be used as evidence. I didn't need to confront him yet. I needed patience and precision. Each passing hour strengthened my resolve, and with every secret uncovered, the picture of his deception became clearer. I realized that he thought he could continue lying effortlessly, but I was learning his patterns, anticipating his moves, and slowly gaining the upper hand. By nightfall, I had gathered enough subtle clues to confirm what I feared the most. The betrayal was ongoing, intentional, and deeper than I had imagined. Yet I didn't feel hopeless. On the contrary, the clarity of truth brought a strange sense of power. I could now navigate this carefully, plan my next steps, and ensure that when the moment came, he would be confronted not just with emotion, but with undeniable reality. The first night had been his nightmare, and soon the days following would turn into mine. Mine to reclaim, mine to strategize, mine to ultimately control. As I lay awake that night, I could feel the shift within me. Fear and heartbreak were still present, but they had been tempered with focus and determination. I realized that this was no longer just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming my life, asserting my strength, and preparing for the day when he would fully understand the consequences of his lies. The game had begun, and I intended to win. By the sixth day, I realized that observing alone was not enough. I needed concrete proof, evidence that he could not deny. My mind worked like a meticulous machine, cataloging every lie, every inconsistency, every secret I had uncovered. Each detail was a puzzle piece, and slowly the full picture of his betrayal was emerging. I knew that when the time came, I could confront him with facts, not just suspicion, and I could no longer allow him to manipulate me with excuses. I started to follow his subtle patterns more closely. The moments when he thought I wasn't paying attention were the most revealing. He left his phone unattended, whispered names in the shadows, and his behavior became more cautious under my silent scrutiny. I kept a mental log, noting every irregularity, every hidden glance, every hushed conversation that hinted at a life he had kept from me. It was exhausting, but the more I discovered, the stronger I felt. Knowledge, I realized, was my weapon. One afternoon, I noticed a message pop up from the same unknown contact. Just a fragment, a word, a smiley, a hint of intimacy. It was enough. My heart raced with anger, betrayal, and yet a calm determination that surprised me. I started piecing together a timeline of his deceit, connecting dates, messages, and locations. The magnitude of his betrayal was staggering, but instead of breaking me, it fueled my resolve. I would not be a victim. I would be the one holding the cards when the truth came out.
That evening, I subtly confronted him with small observations, watching his reactions carefully. I didn't accuse him outright, but I asked leading questions, noting every twitch of his face, every hesitation in his voice. He tried to brush me off, smiled nervously, deflected with vague answers, but I could see the panic creeping in. The man who had thought he was in control was starting to falter, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. Each lie he had told was unraveling, thread by thread, and I was ready to weave it all into a confrontation he would never forget. I also began documenting every detail. Screenshots, notes, times, dates. I wanted proof that could not be twisted or denied. It was methodical work, tedious but necessary. Every tiny action, every whispered conversation, every evasive glance became part of the evidence. By the end of the night, I had enough to paint a full portrait of his betrayal. The pieces of the puzzle were falling. That evening, I subtly confronted him with small observations, watching his reactions carefully. I didn't accuse him outright, but I asked leading questions, noting every twitch of his face, every hesitation in his voice. He tried to brush me off, smiled nervously, deflected with vague answers, but I could see the panic creeping in. The man who had thought he was in control was starting to falter, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. Each lie he had told was unraveling, thread by thread, and I was ready to weave it all into a confrontation he would never forget. I also began documenting every detail, screenshots, notes, times, dates. I wanted proof that could not be twisted or denied. It was methodical work, tedious but necessary. Every tiny action, every whispered conversation, every evasive glance became part of the evidence. By the end of the night, I had enough to paint a full portrait of his betrayal. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture was horrifying, yet empowering. I knew I could use it to reclaim my life, and maybe even my dignity, which had been tarnished by his deceit.
As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I reflected on the path ahead. I could no longer rely on hope or trust. I needed strategy, patience, and precision. The betrayal had been deliberate, but so would be my response. I promised myself that when the time came, he would understand the magnitude of his actions. The man who had tried to control me with lies would soon realize that I had always been watching, always been aware, and now I was preparing to act. By the time sleep finally came, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. Fear and heartbreak lingered, but they had been transformed into determination. The first night of our marriage had been a nightmare, but it had also been the catalyst that awakened my strength, sharpened my focus, and prepared me for the confrontation that was inevitable. I had survived the shock, and now I was ready to take the next step. By the seventh day, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Observation and documentation had given me knowledge, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed him to reveal the truth himself, caught in his own lies, where no denial or excuse could save him. I began planning a subtle trap, one that would expose the depth of his betrayal and leave him unable to hide. Every detail had to be precise. Every move had to be calculated. I wasn't acting on emotion anymore. I was acting with purpose. That evening, I left my phone in a place where he would see it, but I didn't leave it entirely unguarded. I crafted a series of messages, half-typed, never sent, designed to provoke a reaction. I mentioned a meeting, a friend, a place I planned to be, knowing that he would respond, likely in secret, to cover his tracks. I watched him from across the room, pretending to relax, but my eyes followed every subtle twitch, every glance at his phone. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. It didn't take long. Within minutes, his behavior shifted. The careful, composed man I had known became restless, nervous, almost desperate. His eyes darted to my phone, his hands fidgeted, and I could see the slight tremor in his jaw as he attempted to hide his actions. Every micro-expression, every evasive glance was confirmation that my trap had worked. He was hiding something, and I was ready to uncover it fully. For the first time, I felt the thrill of control, a dangerous, intoxicating sensation that mingled with my lingering heartbreak.
I continued to press subtly, asking casual questions, creating small situations to observe his reactions. He stumbled, lied, and evaded, each action leaving traces of guilt. I cataloged everything, every hesitation, every contradicting word, every subtle indication that he was not being honest. I realized that his deception was far more elaborate than I had imagined, but this time I was prepared. The shock of discovery had been replaced by clarity, and the fire of determination burned brighter than ever. By nightfall, I had gathered enough subtle evidence to confront him if necessary, but I chose patience. I wanted him to reveal more, to stumble, to expose himself further. The trap had been set, and now I waited, letting his own actions entangle him in the web of his lies. I realized that revenge, even the smallest kind, required timing and precision. Acting too soon could ruin everything. The night had become a game of strategy, and I was determined to win. As I lay in bed, watching him move about the room with forced casualness, I reflected on the transformation within me. The woman who had walked into this room a week ago, full of hope and trust, was gone. In her place was someone alert, calculating, and prepared. I no longer felt powerless. I no longer felt naive.
The betrayal that had nearly crushed me had instead sharpened my mind and hardened my resolve. The first trap had been successful, and I knew the next steps would take us deeper into the truth, one he could no longer hide. By the end of the night, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Pain and betrayal were still there, but they had been tempered with strategy and control. The first trap had shown me that he could be exposed, that lies could be dismantled with patience, observation, and subtle action. The nightmare of our first week of marriage had transformed into a plan to reclaim power, dignity, and eventually justice. And deep down, I knew that the man who thought he had all the control was about to learn, in the most shocking way, that I had been watching all along. The eighth day brought a tension I could barely contain. Every moment felt like walking on the edge of a cliff. One wrong step, one careless move, and the truth could slip away. I had prepared meticulously, setting small traps, observing his reactions, and documenting every secret. But I didn't just want to know. I wanted him to falter, to reveal himself fully, so that there would be no room for denial. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind calculating, every nerve alive with anticipation. That evening, I staged a situation that I knew would make him act. I, accidentally, left a message open on my phone hinting that I knew something, without revealing that I actually knew everything. He noticed immediately. The slight twitch in his expression, the way his hand hesitated over his phone, the sudden tension in his posture. It all confirmed my suspicion. I stayed calm, letting him take the bait, observing as he tried to cover his tracks with practiced ease. But I could see the cracks forming. And then it happened. He made a mistake. A slip of the hand, a glance at a message that he thought I couldn't see. In that instant, everything became clear. The woman, the hidden conversations, the secret meetings, all of it. My chest tightened, a wave of betrayal and rage hitting me at once. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to give them free rein.
This was not the moment for emotion. This was the moment for clarity, for observation, for final proof. I quietly moved closer, pretending to be absorbed in my own task while my mind cataloged everything. I saw him nervously type a message, delete it, glance at the clock, hesitate, and then send another. The precision with which he had tried to hide his actions now worked against him. Every small gesture, every careful evasion was a confirmation of the reality I had been dreading, and yet now I was ready. The nightmare of deception had been revealed, and I held the pieces firmly in my hands. By the end of the night, I had not only caught him red-handed, but also uncovered more than I had imagined. The betrayal went deeper than the messages on his phone. It was woven into the fabric of our relationship, a secret he had nurtured even as I planned a life of love and trust. My anger surged, but so did a cold clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew that patience, precision, and strategy would give me the upper hand. I no longer felt like the victim. I was now the observer, the judge, the one who would dictate the terms of this hidden war. Lying in bed that night, I felt a strange combination of exhaustion and empowerment. I had seen the truth, undeniable and raw. I had proof, patterns, and behaviors that could no longer be hidden. The man who thought he controlled everything had underestimated me, and now, for the first time, I felt a sense of victory, not of confrontation yet, but of preparation. The nightmare had begun with betrayal, but it would continue as I turned knowledge into power. And as sleep finally began to pull me under, I made a silent vow. He would never forget this. He would realize that I had known, that I had watched, and that I had been planning every step with precision. The man who had shattered my trust would soon see that I was no longer powerless, and the nightmare he had begun on our first night together was far from over. After catching him red-handed, I realized that patience was now my greatest ally. Observation and subtle traps had given me proof, but I knew that confronting him without preparation could backfire. I needed control, timing, and precision. The betrayal had shaken me deeply, but it had also awakened a cold clarity I had never known. I could no longer allow him to manipulate or deceive without consequence. This confrontation would be carefully orchestrated, a moment where truth would be undeniable and he would have no choice but to face it. I spent the next few days planning meticulously. Every word, every gesture, every small detail had to be precise. I imagined his reactions, anticipated excuses, and rehearsed my responses silently in my mind. I wanted him to see that I knew everything, not just a part, not just hints, but the entire truth. The woman, the messages, the hidden meetings, it would all come out and he would feel the weight of his betrayal fully. My heart still ached, but it had been replaced with focus and determination. When the day came, I staged it perfectly. I approached him calmly, carrying myself with an air of quiet authority. My eyes met his, and I let him feel my gaze, steady, unwavering, unafraid. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I let the tension build silently, allowing him to sense that something monumental was about to happen. The quiet before the storm was electric, charged with the knowledge I had gathered over the past week. Every fiber of my being was ready, alert and unrelenting. I began with questions, seemingly casual but carefully constructed. Each one was designed to provoke a reaction, to make him reveal more than he intended. At first, he tried to maintain composure, brushing off my inquiries with practiced charm, but the cracks appeared quickly. Hesitations, micro-expressions, nervous twitches, all betrayed him. I could see the panic flicker in his eyes, and for the first time, he realized that the woman he thought he controlled was now in command of the situation. I presented small pieces of evidence one by one, watching his reactions carefully. Each message, each hidden conversation, each lie he had tried to cover was revealed gradually. He stammered, tried to explain, but I didn't allow interruptions. My calm, unwavering demeanor amplified the impact of the truth. I could see the realization dawn on him. Denial was impossible, and the web of deception he had woven so carefully was collapsing around him. By the end of the confrontation, he was visibly shaken. The charm and confidence he had relied on for so long were gone, replaced by guilt, panic, and helplessness. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to cry. The evidence, the careful observations, and the subtle traps I had laid spoke louder than words. I had turned the tables, and for the first time, I felt the empowerment of being in control. The nightmare he had created was now mine to navigate, mine to command, and mine to shape. As the night settled in, I reflected quietly on what had transpired. The first confrontation had not been about revenge. It had been about asserting control, reclaiming dignity, and sending a clear message. Lies and betrayal would no longer go unnoticed. I had survived the shock, observed the truth, and orchestrated the first step in turning the tables. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning. The nightmare of our wedding night had ignited a fire within me that would not be extinguished until justice, in its most precise form, was served. After the first confrontation, a strange calm settled over me. The storm of emotions,
Anger, heartbreak, betrayal still lingered, but they were now tempered with clarity and focus. I realized that my first confrontation had only been the beginning. Knowledge and evidence had given me control, but revenge required more than proof. It required patience, strategy, and precision. I wasn't planning to act impulsively. I was planning to dismantle everything he had built, piece by piece, while maintaining my composure. I began thinking about the ways he had manipulated and deceived, every lie, every secret meeting, every act of betrayal. I traced the patterns of his behavior, recalling the messages, the evaded questions, the nervous gestures. Each memory fueled my determination, sharpening my mind like a knife. I knew that the man who thought he controlled everything had underestimated me. Every deception he had hidden became a potential tool in my arsenal. I would use it carefully, subtly, until there was no escape for him. During the day, I acted as if nothing had happened, keeping up the appearance of calm normalcy. I smiled when he entered the room, laughed at his jokes, and played the part of the loving wife. But beneath that facade I was planning meticulously. I made mental notes of every detail, considering ways to expose him in the most effective way possible. It wasn't about public humiliation, not yet. It was about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring he could never hurt me or manipulate me again. I also started envisioning the end game. How would I confront him fully? What would I reveal, and in what order? How could I ensure that every lie, every betrayal, every deceitful act would come to light without giving him room to manipulate or deny it? Each question became part of a mental blueprint, a careful plan that I would execute step by step. The fire of betrayal had transformed into a methodical, deliberate strategy. I felt a sense of power I had never experienced before. As night fell, I reflected on the week that had passed. The perfect wedding night had turned into a nightmare, but it had awakened something inside me. I had survived the shock, gathered evidence, set traps, and confronted him. Now the nightmare had evolved into a calculated game of strategy. He had been the puppeteer once, but the roles had shifted. I was no longer vulnerable, no longer naive, no longer powerless. Every betrayal he had committed was now an advantage I could wield. I spent hours thinking, planning, and preparing for the moments ahead. Each day, each interaction, each observation was another step toward reclaiming my life and dignity. I wasn't motivated by hatred alone. I was motivated by justice, by the need to regain control of the narrative of my life. I could feel the tension building inside me, a mixture of anticipation, focus, and quiet satisfaction. The first phase of revenge was mental, strategic, and unstoppable. By the end of the night, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The nightmare of our wedding night had been transformed into a mission to reclaim my life, assert my power, and ensure that the man who had betrayed me understood that his actions would have consequences. I knew that the days ahead would be challenging, emotionally charged, and tense, but I was ready. The game had changed, and I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist, and he was about to discover the full extent of what that meant. By the 11th day, I was ready. The mental preparation, the observation, and the careful planning had all led to this moment. I had gathered every piece of evidence, memorized his patterns, and rehearsed my responses to any attempt at denial. The betrayal that had shattered my heart was now transformed into fuel for action.
I knew that this first move had to be precise, subtle yet undeniable, shocking yet controlled. It would set the tone for everything that followed. I chose the moment carefully, waiting until he was off guard, relaxed, and convinced that I was unaware of the full extent of his lies. I spoke casually at first, weaving small truths into our conversation, almost like a game, testing his reactions. His eyes flickered with unease, but he maintained a facade of calm. That brief flicker, however, told me all I needed to know. He feared exposure, and I was the one holding the key. I smiled inwardly, feeling the thrill of control ripple through me. Then I subtly revealed part of the evidence I had collected: messages, times, and small, undeniable facts of his deception. I didn't accuse him outright. Instead, I let him stumble into his own guilt. His hands trembled slightly, and the words he tried to offer as excuses came out awkwardly, halting and unconvincing. I watched, silently savoring the shift in power. For the first time, I felt the sweet satisfaction of seeing him falter, of knowing that he could no longer manipulate the situation with his charm. The rest of the evening became a careful dance. I kept calm, collected, and composed, while he became increasingly restless, trapped by his own actions and my knowledge. Each question I posed, each subtle observation I shared, caused him to squirm, revealing more than I needed. I realized that revenge wasn't just about exposure. It was about psychological dominance, making him understand the gravity of what he had done without raising my voice. The power in quiet control was intoxicating. By nightfall, I had achieved what I had set out to do. My first move had shaken him, made him vulnerable, and given me a glimpse of the fear and regret that had been hidden beneath his confident facade. I felt a surge of empowerment and clarity. This was no longer just about betrayal, it was about reclaiming my life, asserting my strength, and proving that deception had consequences. The first move was a warning, a signal that I was no longer passive. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the transformation within me. The woman who had been blindsided, heartbroken, and naive was gone. In her place was someone alert, strategic, and unafraid. The first move of revenge was just the beginning, but it had already shifted the balance. I was no longer powerless, no longer a victim. I had taken control, and he would soon learn that every lie, every betrayal, and every act of deceit would come with a price. And as sleep pulled me under, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. The days ahead would be filled with tension, calculated actions, and revelations. But I was ready. The nightmare of our first night together had ignited a fire within me that would not be extinguished. He had underestimated me, and the consequences of that mistake would soon unfold in ways he could never predict. The 12th day was tense, charged with a silent electricity I could almost taste. Every interaction felt like a high-stakes game. I had planted my first move carefully, and the reaction I had seen had emboldened me. Now I needed to push further, to escalate the pressure without giving him a chance to regain control. The man who had betrayed me was beginning to realize that I was no longer the naive, trusting woman he thought he could manipulate. I started creating situations that would force him into revealing more. Subtle scenarios where his guilt and fear could no longer be hidden. A casually mentioned dinner with a friend, a reference to a place I planned to visit, even leaving my phone in plain sight with a hint of messages he couldn't resist checking.
All of these were traps. Each time he faltered, each tiny hesitation, I cataloged mentally. Every movement, every flicker of panic was another confirmation of his unraveling facade.
By evening, I had noticed him changing his behavior. He became restless, irritable, and unusually cautious. His usual charm was gone, replaced by a nervous tension that was unmistakable. I knew that fear had begun to seep in. He could sense the walls closing around him, yet he still didn't know how much I truly knew. That realization gave me a subtle, almost silent satisfaction. The first night had been his nightmare, and now, each day, I was taking the reins, turning fear into leverage. I also began documenting everything with more precision: screenshots, notes, times, and dates. I wanted a record so meticulous that no denial could ever withstand it. Each detail, no matter how small, was added to my mental and physical dossier. I realized that revenge required both patience and thoroughness. Exposing him without preparation could ruin the impact. Precision was my ally, control my weapon. Later that night, I orchestrated another subtle test. I mentioned something that I knew would trigger a response: a place he shouldn't have been, a contact he had tried to hide, and I watched him carefully. His reaction was immediate: hesitation, avoidance, a barely perceptible tremor. I stayed calm, letting him sink into the uncomfortable tension of his guilt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was manifesting itself in every gesture, every stammer, every small act of fear. As I lay in bed reflecting on the day, I realized the full extent of the shift in power. I was no longer reacting to his betrayal. I was controlling the pace, the narrative, the tension, and the unfolding of events. The man who had once dictated our life together was now at the mercy of my observation, my strategy, and my patience. The nightmare of our first night had been transformed into a calculated journey of empowerment, and I was leading it. Sleep came with a sense of anticipation rather than fear. I knew the days ahead would be challenging, emotionally intense, and filled with subtle maneuvers, but I was ready. Each day brought me closer to the full revelation, the confrontation where every lie would be laid bare and every deception would be accounted for. The game had shifted, and I was no longer the player being manipulated. I was the strategist, quietly orchestrating the unraveling of the man who had betrayed me. By the 13th day, I knew the time had come for a major escalation. The small tests, the subtle observations, and the strategic moves had all brought me here, to a point where his lies could no longer hide, and the truth would finally hit him with full force. I felt a mix of anticipation and a quiet, simmering rage. The man who had betrayed me thought he could manipulate, deceive, and charm his way through our marriage, but he had underestimated me, and I intended to make him face that mistake fully. I chose the evening carefully. The house was quiet, the atmosphere deceptively calm, but I could feel the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. I approached him with a deliberate, steady calm, allowing the weight of my presence to settle around him. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse. Instead, I let the silence speak, letting him sense that something monumental was about to unfold. The flicker of unease in his eyes told me he already knew he was about to be cornered. I began by casually mentioning details that only someone who knew the full truth could know. The hidden messages, the suspicious meetings, the secrets he had tried to bury. I revealed them one by one, watching his reaction with careful precision.
He tried to deflect, to laugh it off, to charm me into doubt, but I stayed unwavering. Each revelation was a strike, and with every strike, I saw panic and guilt spread across his face. For the first time, the power had shifted completely. I pulled out the evidence I had meticulously collected: screenshots, notes, times, dates, everything. I laid it all out before him, piece by piece, letting him see that I had known all along. The man who had thought he could manipulate me now sat frozen, unable to deny anything. His voice faltered, stammered, and broke as he tried to explain. But there was no escape. Every lie, every deceit, every betrayal he had hidden for so long was now undeniable, and I could see the weight of realization crush him. The air between us was thick with tension. I could feel my own heartbeat, steady and controlled, while his raced with panic and fear. I realized that revenge was no longer about punishment. It was about empowerment, about asserting control and reclaiming my life. I could have screamed, cried, or lashed out, but I didn't. My composure, my calm authority was more powerful than any outburst. The full weight of truth had become my ally, and he was powerless against it. By the end of the night, I had established something more than just exposure. I had set the stage for him to understand the magnitude of his actions. The man who had betrayed me was broken, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, and morally. He had underestimated the woman he married, and now he was facing the consequences of every lie he had told. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and for the first time, I felt a sense of liberation. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The nightmare of our wedding night had been the catalyst, igniting a fire within me that refused to be quenched. I had survived heartbreak, observed deception, set traps, and confronted betrayal. Now the game had changed. I was no longer a victim. I was in control, and the man who thought he could manipulate me now learned, far too late, that he was at my mercy. The confrontation had shifted everything, but it wasn't enough. Seeing him crumble under the weight of truth was satisfying, yet I knew that true empowerment required action beyond mere exposure. I needed to make him feel the consequences of his betrayal, not just emotionally, but in the life he thought he controlled. I spent hours planning, considering every detail, every moment, every interaction that could maximize the impact. Revenge was no longer a thought. It was a carefully orchestrated mission. The first strike was subtle but potent. I began using the knowledge I had gathered to subtly influence those around him, planting seeds of doubt in the people who mattered most in his life. Conversations that he thought were private were now framed to reveal small inconsistencies, just enough to make others question his integrity. Each interaction, each whispered word was like a chess move, carefully calculated to put him off balance without revealing my hand. The thrill of control coursed through me as I watched him navigate this invisible pressure.
At home, I continued to maintain the facade of calm normalcy. I smiled, I laughed, I acted as if life were perfectly ordinary, all while orchestrating a silent storm around him. Each carefully placed hint, each casual observation shared in the wrong context forced him to stumble. The man who had once thought he was untouchable now walked on eggshells, fearful that every move could be another exposure. I had turned his world into a minefield, and he didn't even know the depth of my planning. The psychological pressure began to work in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I could see subtle changes in his demeanor, hesitation, overcompensation, moments of panic disguised as calm. His charm and composure, which had once masked every lie, were now shadows of themselves. I realized that revenge wasn't about confrontation alone. It was about creating a constant awareness that every action, every choice could be scrutinized and held accountable. Power, I discovered, lay in control, patience, and timing. Late at night, I reflected on the magnitude of what I had set into motion. The man who had betrayed me was no longer in control. Every lie, every secret, every deception was now a tool I wielded with precision. I felt a sense of liberation unlike anything I had imagined. This wasn't just about punishing him, it was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of justice. The nightmare of our wedding night had transformed into a path of empowerment, one that I was walking with purpose and confidence. By the end of the week, I had seen the first effects of my moves. Friends and acquaintances began questioning his behavior. Subtle hints caused him to stumble in conversations, and the tension in his daily life was palpable. The man who had once thought he controlled everything was now reacting to my every action, every word, every subtle indication of awareness. I realized that true revenge wasn't loud, it was precise, patient, and methodical. And I had just begun. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a dark satisfaction. The first strike had been subtle, yet effective. I had reclaimed a portion of the power that had been stolen from me, and it shown him, in ways both visible and invisible, that betrayal has consequences. The nightmare of our wedding night had started on our wedding night, but it was far from over. I was no longer a victim. I was the strategist, and the game had only just begun. By the 15th day, I had realized that subtle strikes were effective, but to truly reclaim my power, I had to hit where it hurt most. His fears, the insecurities he had long hidden behind his charm. I spent hours considering every weakness, every hidden anxiety, every moment he had ever shown vulnerability. The man who had betrayed me thrived on control, but control was fragile, and I had learned exactly where to push to break it. I began planting situations designed to make him confront himself. I referenced his own lies in conversations with others, hinted at hidden truths in casual remarks, and created moments where his guilt could no longer be hidden behind a smile. Each time he stumbled, I observed, noting the small cracks that widened with every interaction. The realization that he could no longer manipulate or charm his way out of exposure gave me a surge of satisfaction and power I had never felt before. At home, I maintained an air of calm detachment. I smiled politely, laughed at his jokes, and pretended life was ordinary, all while orchestrating a silent psychological pressure that left him restless. Every glance, every subtle word, every carefully timed observation became a tool to unsettle him. The man who had once dominated our life now walked on fragile ground, unsure of what I truly knew or what my next move might be. The pressure began to affect him in unexpected ways. He became irritable,
defensive and paranoid, overthinking every interaction. The small panic flickers I had observed earlier were now more pronounced, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as his carefully constructed persona began to crumble. Each night, I documented his behavior, cataloging the effects of my subtle manipulations. Revenge, I realized, was not just about confrontation, it was about creating an environment where he could no longer hide from his own conscience. One evening, I orchestrated a conversation with a friend he trusted, planting just enough information to make him falter. His attempts to explain himself were awkward, unconvincing, and even transparent to the outsider. I observed from a distance, silently reveling in the unfolding consequences of his deception. For the first time, I felt the complete shift in power. The man who had betrayed me was now reacting to me, living under the pressure I had carefully engineered. By the end of the week, I could see the transformation fully. He was no longer the confident, manipulative man I had married. The guilt, the fear, and the uncertainty were now etched into every movement, every glance, and every word. I had begun to reclaim my dignity, my strength, and my life. The nightmare of our wedding night had sparked this fire, and now I was guiding it with precision, ensuring that every betrayal he had committed had consequences he could not escape. As I lay in bed that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of control. The first strikes had worked, and the escalation into his deepest fears had begun to dismantle the life he thought he had over me. The game had shifted completely, and I was no longer a victim. I was the strategist, the observer, and the orchestrator of the consequences he had never imagined. The nightmare had started on our wedding night, but it was evolving, and I was leading it every step of the way. By the 16th day, I knew subtle strikes and private psychological pressure were no longer enough. The man who had betrayed me needed to face the consequences in a way that would be undeniable, visible, and unforgettable. I began planning a confrontation that would expose him to those who mattered most in his life, friends, family, colleagues, leaving no room for charm, excuses, or denial. The thought of finally seeing him accountable on a public stage ignited a fierce determination within me. I spent hours strategizing every detail: who would be present, what evidence to reveal, and how to frame it so that the impact would be complete. All of it had to be calculated. I wanted to ensure that each lie, each act of betrayal, and each secret would be undeniable. Timing was crucial. One misstep could lessen the effect or give him a chance to manipulate the narrative. This confrontation would be my masterpiece, the culmination of every observation, every trap, and every piece of evidence I had gathered.
The day arrived, and I approached it with calm precision. I invited those who mattered subtly without revealing the full extent of my plan. I maintained an air of casual composure, letting the normalcy of my behavior mask the storm I had orchestrated. Meanwhile, I could feel his anxiety growing, subtle yet unmistakable, as he sensed that I was about to reveal the truth in a way he could no longer control. The tension between us was electric, a silent battle of wills where I was firmly in command. I began the confrontation subtly, dropping hints, referencing inconsistencies, and observing his reactions. He stumbled almost immediately, the facade of control cracking with every small revelation. I then presented the evidence,
Messages, photos, hidden conversations, all meticulously arranged to show the full scope of his betrayal. The room went silent. Those present watched, astonished, as the man who had once seemed untouchable struggled to respond. There was no charm, no excuse, no way to evade the truth. The impact was immediate. Friends, colleagues, and family began to question him, cross-checking details I had revealed. His panic was palpable, and I observed every gesture with quiet satisfaction. The power had shifted completely. I realized that revenge was not only about justice, it was about reclaiming control over the narrative, showing him that deception has consequences, and proving to myself that I was no longer the powerless wife he had tried to manipulate. By the end of the evening, he was visibly broken. The man who had betrayed me, who had thought himself clever and untouchable, was now exposed, vulnerable, and unable to manipulate reality. I felt a sense of empowerment that went beyond satisfaction. It was liberation. The nightmare of our wedding night had ignited a transformation in me, one that had turned betrayal into strategy, heartbreak into precision, and deception into an opportunity for justice. As I lay in bed that night, reflecting on the day's events, I realized how far I had come. I had turned shock into observation, pain into planning, and betrayal into action. The public reckoning was only a step in the journey, but it had demonstrated the power of patience, strategy, and controlled action. I was no longer a victim. I was a force, and the man who had shattered my trust had finally learned that his actions carried consequences he could not escape. The morning after the public reckoning, the house felt eerily quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. I awoke with an unsettling calm in my chest, the kind that comes after a storm when you finally understand just how much destruction still lies beneath the surface. The confrontation had shattered his carefully crafted image in front of everyone, but I knew that the true cracks, the deep, personal ones, were still forming. He wasn't done falling, and I wasn't done watching. When he finally walked into the room, he looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of the truth was crushing him from the inside. His eyes avoided mine, filled with embarrassment, confusion, and a desperation he could no longer hide. For a moment, I simply observed him, the way one might study the remnants of a broken monument, once impressive, now reduced to rubble. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, silence became my weapon, and it echoed around him louder than any accusation could. Throughout the day, his attempts to regain control were almost pitiful. He tried to explain, to erase parts of the story, to claim misunderstandings, but every effort only highlighted the truth. The mask he had worn for years was gone. I watched him unravel with a cold clarity, knowing that each unraveling thread brought him closer to confronting the part of himself he feared most, the part that needed validation, control, and admiration to survive. Without that, he was exposed, and exposure terrified him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't comfort. Instead, I drew emotional boundaries he had never seen from me before. I spoke only when necessary, answered only in facts, and matched every manipulative attempt with an unwavering calm. The absence of emotional reaction shook him more than anger ever could. He had expected shouting, tears, or pleading, anything that would allow him to regain the upper hand. Instead, he got precision, strategy, and distance, and that broke him in ways he didn't understand. By afternoon, his frustration had turned into panic. He followed me around the house with questions. What are you thinking? What are you planning? Are you leaving? Questions that revealed fear rather than control. I responded with simple, clear statements, each one stripped of emotional cushioning. My calmness cornered him, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had done. He was no longer the center of my world. He was no longer the man who controlled the narrative. He was just a consequence. Later that evening, he tried once more to apologize, but this time the words felt rehearsed, weak, almost mechanical. Apologies were meaningless without accountability, and he still wasn't capable of facing the full truth of his betrayal. I watched him break down in frustration, the facade of strength dissolving until he seemed like a stranger wearing my husband's face. I realized then that the man I had loved never truly existed. The illusion had been shattered, and what stood before me was someone I no longer recognized or needed. When I went to bed that night, I felt neither triumph nor sadness. Instead, I felt clarity, a deep, powerful understanding that I was finally walking out of the shadow he had cast over my life. The public reckoning had broken his image, but chapter 17, this moment, this day, it broke him. And in the quiet darkness of my room, I knew the transformation wasn't just his. It was mine too. The woman who once feared losing him now understood the truth. Losing him was never the tragedy. Loving him had been. The following morning, something in the air felt different, heavier, sharper, as if even the sunlight filtering through the curtains knew that the thin thread holding him together was about to snap. I sat at the edge of the bed, letting the stillness settle around me while he moved through the house like a ghost. His steps were slower, his shoulders hunched, his voice muted. The confident, charming man he once paraded himself as no longer existed. What remained was an exhausted shell trying desperately to breathe inside a reality he had caused. I watched him from a distance as he lingered near the doorway, glancing at me with eyes filled with fear he couldn't articulate. There was no anger in me, no trembling emotion, only a cold, steady clarity. I could tell that this calmness disturbed him more than anything else. A part of him had always relied on my softness, my forgiveness, my willingness to bend. But now that I no longer reached for him, he had nothing familiar to hold on to. And it terrified him. Throughout the morning, he made several attempts to engage me. Light conversation, small gestures, subtle hints of remorse. But they were hollow. His apologies still danced around the truth, never touching the heart of it. He wanted reassurance, not redemption. He wanted my reaction, not my resolution. And when he realized I wasn't giving him either, the panic in his eyes deepened. He was beginning to understand that losing my love wasn't his biggest fear. Losing my attention was. By noon, he finally cracked. His voice broke as he stood in front of me, demanding answers with a desperation that bordered on frantic. He wanted to know what I was planning, what the future held, if there was any chance of forgiveness. The truth was simple. I didn't owe him any emotional clarity. He had taken my trust without hesitation. I had every right to reclaim my peace without explanation. Watching him crumble as he realized I was no longer emotionally accessible felt like watching the last illusion fall. the illusion that he still held any power over my heart. I answered him calmly, kindly even, but with boundaries as sharp as steel. I told him that forgiveness wasn't something he could beg for. It required accountability, empathy, and genuine change, qualities he had never shown. I told him that healing wasn't linear, and I wasn't required to offer comfort to the person who caused my wounds. And as my words sank into him, I watched his expression shift from panic to a quiet, devastating awareness. He was finally facing the truth he had avoided for months. He wasn't losing me. He had already lost me. For the first time, he stopped trying to defend himself. He stopped searching for excuses. He stopped pretending. He simply sat there in silence, staring at the floor, shoulders shaking with a grief that was raw and real. In that moment, I realized that this was the version of him I had been waiting to see. Not the charming performer, not the manipulator, not the victim he claimed to be. This was the truth, and it was far less powerful than he had always believed. When night fell, I walked outside for fresh air, feeling the cool wind against my skin like a gentle reminder of the world beyond him, bigger, freer, waiting for me. The house, the marriage, the pain, none of it held me anymore. And as I looked back through the window at the man sitting in the dim room alone, I understood the final shift. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about closure. The last illusion had fallen, and with it, the last piece of him that held me hostage. The next morning arrived with an unsettling calm, the kind of stillness that comes right before a long-buried truth forces its way into the light. I woke before him and lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange mix of heaviness and liberation in my chest. For the first time in a long while, the weight I carried wasn't made of fear or heartbreak. It was made of decision, the kind that changes the direction of your entire life. I knew today was different. Today was the day I would finally step into my freedom, even if it terrified him. When he finally woke, I watched him from across the room as he blinked through the remnants of a restless night. His whole face looked aged, tired eyes, pale skin, a tension around his mouth that hadn't been there before. He wasn't pretending anymore. The mask was gone. The lies had exhausted him. And for a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us holding everything we once were and everything we could never be again. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe he already knew I was slipping beyond his reach.
The morning felt heavy with unspoken truths as I prepared breakfast in silence. He followed me from room to room like a lost shadow, as if afraid that if he looked away, I would disappear entirely. And maybe I would. His questions were soft now, almost timid. Are we okay? Can we fix this? Do you still love me? Questions that once would have shattered me, but now they floated past me like empty echoes. I didn't hate him. I didn't love him. I just didn't belong in the ruins of what we had built anymore. By afternoon, he finally broke the silence with a trembling honesty I had never seen from him. He confessed everything, not the polished, half-truth version he used before, but the raw, unfiltered ugliness of his betrayal. He spoke about his insecurities, his need for validation, the other woman, the lies he told himself, and the lies he told me. He admitted he didn't cheat because he lacked love for me, but because he lacked love for himself. Hearing it didn't heal anything, but it confirmed something I already knew. His betrayal was never about me. It was always about the emptiness inside him
that he tried to fill by destroying the people who loved him. When he broke down, truly broke down, collapsing into the truth of himself, I felt a strange mixture of empathy and distance. I could feel his pain, but it no longer anchored me. I could see his sorrow, but it no longer shaped mine. For years, I had carried the guilt of his choices, wondering what I lacked, what I failed to give. But in that moment, watching him admit the truth aloud, I realized I had never been the problem. I was just the closest mirror to the parts of him he couldn't face. Later, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the living room, he asked me quietly if there was any part of my heart left for him. The question stung, not because I yearned for him, but because I remembered the girl I used to be, the one who would have given up everything just to keep him smiling. I owed her honesty. I owed both of us freedom. So I told him the truth. I cared, but I no longer belonged here. My heart had stopped breaking for him. It had started beating for me. That night, as he sat in silence with tears he tried to hide, I felt the final shift inside me. This chapter of my life was ending, not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity. I was no longer the woman waiting for him to choose me. I was the woman choosing herself. And tomorrow would be the day I walked out of this house and never looked back. I woke the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the room washed in a pale blue hush that felt almost sacred. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence breathe around me, feeling the weight of the decision I had carried for weeks settle gently into certainty. This was the day, the final step, the moment I would reclaim the life I had allowed to shrink inside someone else's shadow. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt something deeper, something steadier. I felt free in a way I hadn't felt in years. I packed quietly, carefully, folding each piece of clothing with a calmness that surprised even me. Each item I placed into my suitcase felt like a piece of my past I was choosing to carry forward, not because it held pain, but because it reminded me of how far I had come. I didn't take much, just enough to start again, enough to honor the strength I had fought so hard to rebuild. When I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound echoed through the room like a soft, final goodbye. He woke up minutes later. The confusion in his eyes turned quickly to panic as he saw the packed bag beside me. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking, "don't do this." But there was no fight in him now, no manipulation, no rehearsed speeches. Just the raw, broken plea of a man finally understanding that consequences don't wait for comfort. He tried to stand in front of the doorway, as if blocking it would hold me in a place I no longer belonged. His hands trembled, his voice stumbled, and yet nothing he said touched me the way it used to. My heart had already walked out long before my body did. He begged me to stay long enough to talk, long enough to try again, long enough to promise something he should have offered the first time he broke me. I listened, not out of love, but out of respect for the version of myself who once loved him deeply. But nothing he said changed the truth. I could forgive him, but I could not live inside the same wound again. I could empathize with his pain, but I could not rebuild my life around it. He had shattered the trust that held our marriage together, and no apology could resurrect the version of me who waited for him on our wedding night. When I finally picked up the suitcase and walked past him, he broke, truly broke,
He grabbed his face with both hands, sinking onto the floor as if the world had collapsed beneath him. The sound of his sobbing filled the hallway, raw and unfiltered, echoing off the walls we once decorated with dreams. I paused for a moment, not because I doubted my decision, but because I wanted to remember this exact second. The moment he realized he had lost something irreplaceable. The moment I realized I had finally found myself. Stepping outside, the morning air felt different, brighter, cooler, alive. The sky was slowly shifting from blue to gold as the sun pushed through the horizon. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the fresh start settle into my lungs. I wasn't walking away from a marriage. I was walking toward my future, toward my healing, toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet, but already loved. The quiet street, the soft bird song, the gentle hum of the world waking up, it all felt like a promise. And as I walked toward the taxi waiting for me, I didn't look back once. Not because I hated him, but because I had finally learned that looking back always takes you further away from where you're meant to go. My story wasn't ending here. It was beginning. And for the first time in years, the beginning was mine. If you felt this journey in your chest, if you've ever walked away from someone who didn't value you until it was too late, don't leave without subscribing. More stories of healing, heartbreak, power, and rebirth are waiting for you. Your story matters. And here, your voice is never alone. I packed quietly, carefully, folding each piece of clothing with a calmness that surprised even me. Each item I placed into my suitcase felt like a piece of my past I was choosing to carry forward, not because it held pain, but because it reminded me of how far I had come. I didn't take much, just enough to start again, enough to honor the strength I had fought so hard to rebuild. When I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound echoed through the room like a soft, final goodbye. He woke up minutes later. The confusion in his eyes turned quickly to panic as he saw the packed bag beside me. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking, "don't do this." But there was no fight in him now, no manipulation, no rehearsed speeches. Just the raw, broken plea of a man finally understanding that consequences don't wait for comfort. He tried to stand in front of the doorway, as if blocking it would hold me in a place I no longer belonged. His hands trembled, his voice stumbled, and yet nothing he said touched me the way it used to. My heart had already walked out long before my body did. He begged me to stay long enough to talk, long enough to try again, long enough to promise something he should have offered the first time he broke me. I listened, not out of love, but out of respect for the version of myself who once loved him deeply. But nothing he said changed the truth. I could forgive him, but I could not live inside the same wound again. I could empathize with his pain, but I could not rebuild my life around it. He had shattered the trust that held our marriage together, and no apology could resurrect the version of me who waited for him on our wedding night. When I finally picked up the suitcase and walked past him, he broke, truly broke. He grabbed his face with both hands, sinking onto the floor as if the world had collapsed beneath him. The sound of his sobbing filled the hallway, raw and unfiltered, echoing off the walls we once decorated with dreams.
I paused for a moment, not because I doubted my decision, but because I wanted to remember this exact second. The moment he realized he had lost something irreplaceable. The moment I realized I had finally found myself. Stepping outside, the morning air felt different, brighter, cooler, alive. The sky was slowly shifting from blue to gold as the sun pushed through the horizon. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the fresh start settle into my lungs. I wasn't walking away from a marriage. I was walking toward my future, toward my healing, toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet, but already loved. The quiet street, the soft bird song, the gentle hum of the world waking up, it all felt like a promise. And as I walked toward the taxi waiting for me, I didn't look back once. Not because I hated him, but because I had finally learned that looking back always takes you further away from where you're meant to go. My story wasn't ending here, it was beginning. And for the first time in years, the beginning was mine. If you felt this journey in your chest, if you've ever walked away from someone who didn't value you until it was too late, don't leave without subscribing. More stories of healing, heartbreak, power, and rebirth are waiting for you. Your story matters. And here, your voice is never alone.